Hey everyone, welcome back to Epic Tomorrows. It's now my great pleasure to talk to Chaia Heller, who's a faculty member on the Institute of Social Ecology. I recently did the Intro to Social Ecology course with the ISE. It was really fantastic, really amazing. And Chaia's lecture was one of my favorites. Chaia Heller is a writer, activist, anthropologist, and artist who has been teaching political and feminist theory at the Institute for Social Ecology for nearly 4 decades now. Chaia has been active in movements ranging from ecofeminism and the left Greens to the global justice movement, Occupy, and more recently, Black Lives Matter. Chaia is the author of The Ecology of Everyday Life, published by Black Rose Books, and Food, Farms and Solidarity, published by Duke of University Press. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's a real pleasure.
And thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Fantastic. And it's great that you've got some of your artwork. You told me a few minutes ago in the background. I'll explore that a bit at another point. So yeah, your chapter in The Ecology of Everyday Life on illustrative opposition really blew my mind. It's actually, as I said to you in an email, it's one of the most interesting, one of the most inspiring non-fiction, serious political stuff that I've ever read. So I'm really grateful that we can discuss it some more. So I'm just going to read first of all a paragraph from the beginning of that chapter. So you wrote, "While we know it is crucial to engage in particular ecological struggles, while we know that such struggles are necessary to slow down the pace of wider ecological collapse, we also know that addressing single issues alone is insufficient to bring about radical social and political transformation." So yeah, I mean, that really struck me because sometimes it seems like it's an either or thing. Like I've met some kind of anarchist types, so some of my friends who have been quite, well, maybe with good reason, but they've been quite disparaging of my involvement with groups like Extinction Rebellion because they see them as single issue groups, and I understand the deeper criticism, anarchist and social ecologist criticism of society, but I wonder if you could say some more on the necessary and the sufficient, and explain that just to the viewers who might not be familiar with those terms.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the term I would use for this kind of problem is that people create these kind of false dilemmas where I have to choose between either dealing with this very urgent, single issue, whether it be ecological, whether it be, police brutality, whether it be, the school to prison system, or I'm going to work on, a universalist kind of internationalist project that's revolutionary, so it's either I'm going to be addressing issues that are local or regional or national or global ecological issues or social issues, or I'm going to be revolutionary. And I think, what I learned from working with Bookchin, in my 20s, was that you have to do both. And that's what we did. And he never said, said, here's how we're going to do both. We just did both. And I observed that as we did our work, we were always taking a specific issue. I was living in Burlington, Vermont, and we would literally build, explain to the public why this particular issue was really important, but we would build out a program that had a revolutionary outlook and that had a revolutionary vision, so that while we were addressing the single local issue at hand that was burningly, important and necessary, we were also at the same time educating ourselves and the public about the need to create a broader, more universal or internationalist kind of movement that would change the world. And again, working with Murray, I never felt like we were having this false dilemma of do we do this or that. It was always both and. We had a study group, and we had an organizational meeting, 1 or 2 every week. And so we were always both organizing and doing direct action and doing education in our community, and we were studying revolutionary history and studying about the issues that we were trying to address. It was both and.
So what kind of direct actions were you doing? What were the sort of immediate issues that any that spring to mind?
Yeah, I mean, a main one that we had always like a lot of balls in the air, but I remember like a main one was the waterfront in Burlington, Vermont in the 80s was kind of like this topic of hot debate because the mayor, who was Bernie Sanders,
Oh,
who was sort of known as like the socialist mayor. And we'd always say, you're not a socialist, you know, big or small s, you're a democratic socialist, maybe,
okay.
which to Bernie at the time was like the greatest insult, which ironically he came to run as a democratic socialist. So Bernie Sanders and his progressive coalition wanted to develop the waterfront. And I say develop in quotations because it wasn't really a development. He wanted to develop the waterfront to create jobs. That's what he would say, jobs. And in the short term, it would have created jobs. He was going to create luxury condos on this public, beautiful piece of waterfront property, and luxury condos, luxury hotels, and he's going to basically destroy a lot of wetland and take an area of Burlington that was really being enjoyed by the public. People would picnic there and, you know, watch fireworks from there. It was just a grassy area, and it was going to be totally privatized. So this campaign went on for years. We were the Burlington Greens. We were dealing with the waterfront, but we would do either direct actions, or we would do street theater, or we would do teach-ins at public libraries about how it came to be that property becomes privatized and it becomes developed and inaccessible to people, and how it came to be that nobody has any decision-making forum, that no citizens living in Burlington had a place to go to decide about the waterfront. You know, they could, there was no referendum. They could vote for a representative, you know, to vote on their behalf. They could be constituents, but they couldn't be citizens to directly express what they wanted the waterfront to look like. And after a certain amount of time, you know, we would show up at various city council meetings and different ward meetings and neighborhood council meetings, and they'd be like, oh, here come the Burlington Greens again. And we were, you know, we would joke that we were a broken record for direct democracy. And we would say, yeah, if that's like the best thing that you could say to us, that every time we're going to talk about the waterfront, we're going to talk about the lack of democracy and what would it look like to live in a world where we actually have democracy. So we would make very clear that we're fighting to create a waterfront that has public access and is enjoyed by all citizens. And we're fighting for a new kind of society that is directed and enjoyed by all citizens. And we won. And if you go to the Burlington waterfront in Vermont, you will see a public boathouse where, for very inexpensive, people can rent a boat. And there's picnic spaces and a little park, and it's all public. We won. And you know, there was something just so beautifully utopian about that event, because we didn't just win the waterfront, but we won people into thinking in a different way about politics. And we taught people about direct democracy, and we taught people about, the term we used then was libertarian municipalism. Now the term is communalism. So we taught people about communalist politics, and we taught people about what capitalism is and how it works. And, you know, we created kind of like a living organic school as we were fighting for this particular issue. And we were promoting a revolutionary outlook that really affected a lot of people.
Okay, that's really inspiring, and it's particularly inspiring that Murray Bookchin was involved in the practical side, and
Oh yeah.
because I've read the collection of essays, The Next Revolution, and you wouldn't get from that, because I've read some other sort of anti-capitalist or capitalist critique stuff like David Harvey and some others I can't remember right now, but you wouldn't get from reading the Bookchin that I've read anyway, because I'm not very well read, that he was also involved in the practical side. So it's great for people to know that.
Yeah, I mean, it's so fascinating. I've actually never really thought about it, but he didn't write about his organizing, but Murray was, he worked in a steel foundry,
Really?
I think for 4 years organizing.
Wow.
And he never was not organizing, literally. And he was critical of anybody who just sat around,
Yeah.
thinking. That's, he was very critical of the academy. People often confuse being an academic with being an intellectual. He was a radical, autonomous intellectual scholar, totally self-taught. He was an autodidact. I think finished high school, that was it. He completely gave himself his own education,
Amazing.
but he absolutely felt like anybody who came to Burlington to work with him, it was, and what are you going to work on? So everybody was working in several projects, and he was very active in, after '84, we started the Green Movement in the US. That was supposed to be a communalist movement. And so he was very active in his local our Burlington Greens group. Then he was active in the national Greens. He was active international Greens stuff, but he was always locally very active. I went to so many actions with Murray. It was a lot of anti-nuclear stuff in the 80s when I lived in Burlington.
Yeah.
And as he got older, he had very severe osteoarthritis, and it was hard for him to walk. And so, like the last probably 15 years of his life, he really could not, he had to use a scooter, he couldn't walk very well. But he was still organizing. He was still involved with organizing groups in various iterations of the Greens, and he physically couldn't be on the scene to do stuff, but he was very critical of people who were not actively organizing and working. And he'd always, after when I left Burlington, it was always like, what are you working on, Chaia?
Right.
He always asked me, are you in a study group? Are you teaching? And what are you working on?
I need to get more active. Yeah. So to bring it back to the sufficient, the difference between the sufficient and the necessary. So we could say that to be liberated from capitalism, the sufficient measures are to build some kind of social ecological society. But in terms of what's necessary, right now with the climate crisis getting worse, and also with climate injustice disproportionately affecting women, like especially women and girls, especially in the global south. I wonder if you have anything to say, bearing in mind what we spoke about before the introduction. If you have anything to say about how the ISE should move forward in how it teaches the ecological and climate crisis, and particularly with respect to women and feminism and climate injustice faced by women and girls. Because I feel like there's something a bit lacking, as I said to you before, there's something a little bit lacking, although the introductory course was really amazing. It blew my mind, and I would recommend anyone to do it, anyone who's watching this, to do the course. At the same time, I felt there was something lacking around feminist studies and the way that ecofeminism was kind of branched off a bit, sort of along with New Age stuff. And I wonder whether Bookchin himself, because of the time he lived in, partly, I don't know whether that's an excuse, but much though I respect him, maybe he had a bit of a lack of depth of analysis of the feminist side of things.
No, not at all. I mean, what's really interesting about that is that, Bookchin was a guy who was a Marxist as a child. He joined the Communist Party at 9 years old, and then became a Trotskyist. And basically, by the time the 60s rolled around, and he saw the women's movement in particular, he was absolutely blown away and moved. The civil rights movement, the women's movement, the ecology movement, they kind of blew his mind because it completely, you know, busted the mold for how, as a Marxist, he'd really understood who the historical subject is. You know, it wasn't the worker anymore. It was people who were fighting for civil rights, who were oppressed, you know, African Americans who were ancestors of slaves. And there were the women's movement was really, really moving to him. And when he helped create the curriculum for the Institute for Social Ecology with Dan Chodorkov, they were kind of mapping it out. And Murray said, we have to have a course on feminism. We've got to bring in somebody really involved in the feminist movement and bring together feminism and social ecology. And they were using the prefix eco for all the different classes. So there's a class on ecotechnology, a class on eco-agriculture, a class on eco-community, and then there's a class on ecofeminism. So believe it or not, Bookchin used the term ecofeminism in the 70s, in 74, before at least any women that I knew. It was, you know, I'm not going to say he coined the term because there was a bit of kind of simultaneity about women thinking about ecology, and it was kind of an obvious merging of words, but he knew that that was completely central to social ecology, was to create a feminist perspective within social ecology. And so he invited a young woman at the time, named Anestra King, and she came from a sort of the feminist peace movement and the anti-nuclear movement, and she developed the first curriculum and taught the first class at the ISE and published some really amazing pieces that you can find online. Her last name is King and her first name is Ynestra, Inestra. It's called Nesta. Nesta was my teacher. And so when I landed at the ISE in 1984, and I took her class, which was, I think, one of the most popular classes, except for Murray, besides Murray's, Nesta's class was like the bomb. It was like amazing. And I was like, that's what I want to do. And so the next year I came back and I co-taught a class that was an intro class to ecofeminism. We didn't call it ecofeminism, we called it Social Perspectives on Women and Ecology, or we simply called it Feminism and Ecology. So Nesta would teach an advanced seminar, and for 22 years, I taught the intro class to feminism and ecology. And then the last 10 years when Nesta wasn't doing it anymore, I taught both classes. So in addition to teaching Bookchin's theory. So at the ISE, feminism was and has always been a central outlook, a central lens through which to look at the world, and women are central to any revolutionary movement. And Bookchin absolutely knew that.
Yeah.
And I'll just say the confusion around that, I think, where people started over the years saying, how come Bookchin didn't write about feminism? And part of it was that Murray, and I call him Murray, who's my very dear friend for 22 years. People say, you know, why doesn't Murray write about women? And I'd say, you know, he actually, if you look at the Ecology of Freedom, he does write quite a bit about women and women's roles and the sexual division of labor and complementarity between sexes. He did not feel it was appropriate for him to write feminism or feminist stuff. And I think he did err too much on the side of not writing enough, because he knew I was writing it and Nesta was writing it. And there were so many women and feminists that were also brought to the ISE as speakers, that he felt that there were so many strong feminists talking and teaching about feminism, that he didn't, just the way he didn't write about, and I wish he had, more about race and racism in the US. We had a lot of people come to the ISE who that was their jam, is that they wrote and critically and thought critically about racism. So, and then to make matters a little more challenging is his partner, Janet Beale, wrote a very critical book about ecofeminism. And I think people then thought that Bookchin thought all of feminism was worthless, or that ecofeminism was worthless, which he didn't, because I wrote my book on ecofeminism, The Ecology of Everyday Life, that if you look, he blurbs on the back and gives a very nice compliment to it. And he actually helped me with the title for the book.
Okay.
And he was really happy with the book and proud of it. And so just to clear the record on that, the ISE and Bookchin and social ecology have always been, feminism has been central. But to go back to kind of the false dilemma between necessary preconditions and sufficient preconditions for revolution, I just want to say something on that. It occurred to me at a certain point that so many activists and organizers wouldn't think through, what are all the various kind of necessary conditions that we need to put together to create a sufficient condition for creating not just change around one or two issues, but to create a completely different society. And I have a philosophy background, and that framing device of necessary and sufficient conditions is a really useful kind of thinking device for thinking through. And I use the example in that chapter about how do you boil water? It's not just having the pot and the water source and the heating. You have to have, it's a way of arranging things holistically to create a coherent whole. And when you create the sufficient condition, which is the assemblage of all the necessary conditions, when you create that, it also doesn't mean you're going to succeed. You could have your heating coil and your pot and your water, and you could turn it on, and then I said a rainbow could appear outside, and you decide not to do it, and you turn it off, and you walk out the side, or you don't turn it off, and the house burns down. So the sufficient conditions is not kind of like a deterministic formula, but it's the product of going through a process of really thinking carefully through what are all the various forms of freedom that we need to, as Maria would say, educe or bring forth out of various sets of unfreedom.
Okay, that's a great way of describing it. So can we move on to what you said a bit further on in the chapter about how achieving necessary conditions, dissolving certain hierarchies or achieving certain victories, or even so far as dissolving certain hierarchies and oppressions, can even be compatible with maintaining other hierarchies elsewhere in society. And I wanted to add something which I'm sure you have explored, but it wasn't mentioned in that particular moment, that we could talk about how capitalism actually co-opts liberation in some spheres and potentially uses liberation in some areas of society to worsen the oppression in other areas. Do you think that's an accurate?
Absolutely. I mean,
yeah.
I'll sort of put the capitalist co-optation of movements on a shelf for a second, but this idea that people have sometimes, I call it the domino effect. When I was younger, there were so many Marxist feminists who felt like if we could just get rid of class and get rid of capitalism, then we're going to end patriarchy, and then I would work, with anti-racist organizers and be like, if we can just get rid of racism, that's going to be it. It's going to be the tipping point, and we're going to topple capitalism and the state, and we're going to get rid of patriarchy. And I realized that people really felt, they didn't even know they thought about it, but they did. They had this implicit belief that there was kind of like a domino effect. If you hit one domino, racism, patriarchy, capitalism, the state, that they would all fall.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, history has made it really clear that's not true. That you can, live in a country like Brazil, where there's a lot of racialized diversity. And in many ways, there's a lot of diversity among leadership in Brazil, but there's still so much racism. And even though there's so much racial diversity and inclusivity in Brazil, capitalism is very alive and well.
Yeah.
We saw with the former Soviet Union. I'm older than you. I lived through watching this former Soviet Union, and people really, a lot of people really believed that if you got rid of capitalism, you get rid of the state, when in fact the opposite happened. The state grew increasingly powerful, and what we ended up having was state-managed capitalism. And as we know, it's a very authoritarian. And so Bookchin's emphasis on non-hierarchy as a general sort of like pot in which to put the sufficient condition, to have that broad category of non-hierarchy or anti-hierarchy is so important, because if you don't root out all forms of hierarchy, there are forms of hierarchy that can completely exist without others. And the most obvious ones that are kind of blow people's minds is to realize you could have an ecological society, which we did until the last 100 years or so, and you would still have horrifying patriarchy, racism, colonialism, capitalism, the state, right?
Yeah.
The ancient Egyptians worshipped nature, literally. The Mesoamericans, the Aztecs, the Inca, literally worshipped nature and sacrificed women, and had very, very rigid authoritarian stratified society that was highly patriarchal. So you could have an ecological society, and that's not sufficient to have a good society. You could have a post-race society. When did we have that? Before there was race. Go 500 years back and look at our lives, and there was no real concept of race, say, let's go even like 600 years ago, 700 years ago. But there was absolutely stratification, feudalism, peasants, there was patriarchy, poverty among poor people, so this idea that one form of oppression going down will affect another is not historically accurate, and it's also just not logical.
Yeah. I mean, I was trying to think of how I mean, maybe obviously it's not this simple, but how one form of so-called liberation could actually make another form of oppression worse. If you've got white women gaining rights, then potentially there are more white people in positions of power to oppress non-white people or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, that really happened in the United States in the second wave of feminism. People always say, how did the second wave of feminism in the US go awry? And a lot of it was because there was not an understanding of how this fantasy of white women getting to work and have equality with men in the workplace, didn't take into consideration that Black women had been working always as slaves or as migrant farmers post-slavery,
Right.
or in the service, taking care of white people's children. That if you don't have these, really comprehensive global understanding of how hierarchy works, you're going to create a liberation here while you're, again, even exacerbating or just not addressing the oppression over here.
Yeah. Okay. So moving on a little bit, a bit further on in the chapter, you say that we need to, well, you've already kind of described this. We need to coordinate and reintegrate all that is necessary into a holistic, sufficient, and I really like your use of the word holistic there, because I don't know, once upon a time it seems like holistic was not viewed as a very intellectual word or viewed with suspicion, but when it's used in the right way, it makes total sense. So would it be more convincing for people if there was a systematic analysis of all that is necessary in light of what is sufficient? And what I mean by that is, sorry, I'm struggling a bit here. What I'm trying to say is that it seems like we're so distracted from day to day with the media and the sort of fake politics of the state and everything else. It seems really difficult. Okay, so you've got the theory of Bookchin and social ecology and so on the one hand, which is seen as the kind of utopian on the one hand, and then you've got the single issues that we fight for in our neighborhoods or more broadly on the other hand. But it seems like sometimes there's a lack of a systematic analysis of all of the different necessary things that we need to put together into the sufficient. And how can we help people see well, myself included, with more clarity, a way forward? You know, how can we make this holistic whole that you're talking about? How can
So
we, yeah.
I have, I don't know if it's going to be able to, if I wrote, I'm realizing it might not be dark enough.
Oh,
Can you
diagram,
see?
fantastic. Yeah, I can see that fine, yeah.
Okay. So this is a star that I use that's really useful.
Yeah.
And basically what, if you, for the viewer that cannot see this, I
Yeah.
will say what is on the star. It's a 5-pointed star that I use as a teaching device because I think it's really useful. And I start with very broad categories and I kind of dialectically refine them and differentiate them and make them a little more particular. So we start with the broadest category. We're trying to build from our necessary to sufficient condition, the broadest category of non-hierarchy. And then we think, okay, if we're going to create a form, and Bookchin talks about formalizing freedom, giving form to freedom, what would be the political form of non-hierarchy? And Bookchin believed that's direct democracy, people governing themselves in a non-hierarchical way. So direct democracy would be the next necessary condition. And then you say, okay, so how are we going to organize ourselves in society in terms of creating what we call an economy today, which is just sort of an everyday life of work and play? How would we do that? And we would create what we could call a moral economy. And what that means is that citizens in the popular assemblies make economic decisions that are going to affect how we produce, distribute, and enjoy goods and services. So the logic of direct democracy that holds the logic of non-hierarchy is retained in the idea of a moral economy. So now we have a non-hierarchical and directly democratic economy.
Yeah.
And then if you go over to the principle of ecology and ecological technology, you say, okay, once we're making all these goods and services and we're creating a life together, we're making houses and we're figuring out how to clean things and how to make food and how to use energy. Now we have a principle, we bring this into this dialectic. So now we're going to say we are accountable to the necessary condition of ecology, the principle of ecology, and has to be incorporated into our ecological practices that are technological in scope. So ecology and technology is guided by a moral economy that is guided by citizens who live in a direct democracy, again, in a non-hierarchical way. And then finally, this last necessary condition is what I call radical inclusive humanity. And I'm using that term to mean the absence of unfreedoms and dehumanization in all of their forms. And if you look historically, the first form of hierarchy, Bookchin says, is kind of gerontocracy, the old sort of having a little bit of power over the young in organic societies that are sort of hunter-gatherer societies, before we have the states. The first form of social stratification is gerontocracy. Then we could sort of say we see patriarchy emerge. And then as we start to move through, we see the emergence of the first ancient cities and states, agricultural states, we see class and stratification. And then we move on and we see race and first ethnic oppressions in Phoenicia. Jews come along. Jews weren't a race, it was ethnic. And then we see racism with the colonial project and slavery. And then we have the ecological mess that we have. So all of these isms, all of these kinds of these ways in which people have to reclaim their humanity from the ways that they've been dehumanized as women, as people of color, as Native Americans, as folks in the LGBTQ community, as, I could go on, folks living with disability, that everybody who's been dehumanized, which is 99% of people,
Yeah.
the poor, everybody has to redefine and refine their humanity. And that is part of this whole process. And you can't just eliminate all forms of social oppression by saying, well, we're non-hierarchical. That doesn't work. That's not how social justice works. It actually requires, as we saw in the US in the civil rights movement, people getting together and being able to name and explain their historical experience of dehumanization, and they have to be able to resist it and contest it and to redefine who they are. And the same for women. Women had to get together and have consciousness raising groups in the second wave of feminism and figure out how have we been dehumanized and how can we be rehumanized. And the same again for LGBTQ folks and indigenous people, et cetera. So it's not just a checklist. We're anti-racism or we're non-hierarchical, so we're good. Because I used to hear that in the early 80s, anarchists would say, well, we don't need to have feminism. We're anti-hierarchical, or we don't have to be anti-racist because it goes without saying. And the problem with going without saying is it literally does go unless you say it. So so the necessary conditions include this process of people naming and addressing the very specific ways in which they've been dehumanized. And all of that gets retained into this project of creating a non-hierarchical society. So this is, in my mind, the sort of a roadmap, if you will, that very broadly and generally outlines what are the necessary conditions for creating a good society.
That's really incredibly useful, actually. I think you used that in your lecture as part of the intro course, and I must say I paid much more attention to it this time. I think I got a bit distracted, and it makes a lot more sense now. And yeah, they are broad. The 5 points, they're very broad, necessary conditions, but obviously you can break each one down into more points. And
absolutely.
And it would almost be worth taking a small version of that diagram along to every direct action to sort of remind yourself,
So, I mean, or you're meeting with your group, and you're like, okay, so where, you're working with Extinction Rebellion, and you're thinking, okay, so we're probably in agreement that these are our principles, maybe not, that we believe in non-hierarchy. Can we agree on that? And then can we agree there's something wrong with the state, and that we might want to move towards, a confederal, directly democratic model? And are we agreed there's something wrong with capitalism? Okay, so yeah, we know there's something wrong there. We want to move towards a moral economy. Are we agree there's an ecological crisis? Yup, right? And so, do we agree that these might be tied to these forms of dehumanization, racism, patriarchy, et cetera? So you have this, and now you say, okay, so how do we draw out from this problem of extinction and the goals of the Extinction Rebellion movement? How do we show how hierarchies have brought us to that problem, to this problem moment? How the state, the absence of direct democracy, brought us to the situation where we have no political power to change this horrifying process of species extinction. How has the capitalist system, which is the absence of a moral economy, how has that brought us here? How has living in an anti-ecological society, it's obvious with this particular issue, how has that brought us here? And then how has patriarchy and racism and colonialism, how have they worked also to keep the problem that brought your particular issue of Extinction Rebellion in place? How did all of these elements bring you to this current problem that you're addressing? And then how will turning that over, how will moving towards a non-hierarchical, directly democratic, moral economy, ecological and socially just world, how will that, how can you work toward your particular issue while working for that broader set of goals?
Yeah, I think that there's a really interesting discussion to have here around Extinction Rebellion, because so I do some work with them in the UK, and I've done a little bit on a sort of global level as well. And I think on the global level, there might be more of an open-mindedness to social ecology than on the UK level. But I don't know quite how to explore this because it's quite because of how complex it is. But broadly speaking, obviously, Extinction Rebellion is not a social ecological movement. There is a certain informal hierarchy, which could be it's kind of so in the UK. Well, I think globally as well, it's run on holocracy. I don't know if you're familiar with as a governing system, but I think that's used in different ways in different contexts, and you do end up with certain people and certainly certain spokespeople as well, and the so-called co-founders of the movement having more of a voice and more perceived power and probably more actual power in some contexts. But having said that, there is a lot of open-mindedness in some parts of the movement. It's quite complex to more, I would say, a more social ecological way of thinking. And I'm just wondering, in your view, whether it's possible from within a movement which is very complex and doesn't have a broad agreement on this kind of depth of analysis of capitalism and the answer of some kind of social ecological system. Is it possible from within such a movement to sort of radicalize a movement from within? And are you aware of any cases from history of that happening? And is it almost easier to do that than it is to work in the wider society?
You know, this is such an important issue, and it's always about, where to begin. And it's about sort of analyzing where you're positioned within your movement and within your issue. And the question is, do I go and forge something new, or do I try to work in the organization that I'm located in? And we faced this, in the 80s in the Green Movement, because we set it up to be this kind of confederal, directly democratic movement, and it went off and became a political party. So we created within the Greens a left-green network.
Okay.
And these were people that were drawn to these ideas I was sort of just outlining. And our goal was to educate the broader movement from within and to bring in people. And so we were left Greens. And so in this case, maybe you'd be, I don't know what you'd call yourself, but you'd be, we're this wing of the Extinction Rebellion movement.
Yeah.
And show, here's our program, here's our principles. And you'd bring people who are drawn to these ideas to you. And you might bring also people who are outside of the Extinction Rebellion movement might be drawn to you as well. And at a certain point, maybe you become an autonomous organization, or you might still be within the broader organization that you started out in. I think it sometimes doesn't matter where you start. I think the most important thing is to move with the people that move you, to work with people that are open to the ideas that you're excited about, who have the same level of passion that you do for the causes and the issues that you're drawn to. And I believe people are drawn to specific issues for very real, important reasons. And they can change over the course of your life. But if that's where you're drawn and you're moved by these issues, I would move with the people who are moving with you, and then try to find people within the organization that might be open to having a more revolutionary outlook. And really what's happening here is you'd be moving from a social organization to a political project. And I said there's sort of dichotomies. There's the necessary, the sufficient condition. There's the single issue, or are you being a revolutionary or a single issue person? But often people confuse social justice or social movement work with political revolutionary work.
Yeah.
And again, I'm saying we have to do both. It's not a one or the other. It's a both and. And so a social movement is one where we're trying to create reforms in the capitalist system. We're trying to create, and this is necessary. I'm not writing this off as bourgeois or anything. We have got to get a grip on the ecological crisis. So you're dealing with these necessary social issues. You're trying to reform the state. That's not the political, that's the state. You're trying to change state policy, trying to change corporate policy. Those are really necessary things to do, but it becomes a political movement once you introduce the idea of moving towards a directly democratic political structure as your maximum vision.
Yeah. So
It's
yeah. Well, I was just gonna. I mean, you might be aware, but the demands of Extinction Rebellion include that governments create citizens' assemblies, sort of national citizens' assemblies chosen by sortition, a bit like jury service, a bit like juries chosen by sortition. Supposedly, I haven't done a lot of the research, but the citizens' assemblies on a national level have historically done quite well in comparison to elected governments on certain issues. And I understand that the state is a social and not a genuinely political organism, but would you not say that creating citizens' assemblies on the national level could be a step towards
yeah, I mean, the important point there, the word there is a step towards. And again, looking for another little sign I have here, that again, you shouldn't have to be in these situations where you have to pick between this or that, because they're both necessary, you know?
Yeah.
So the question is, I can't find it, but you know, there's this other framing device where we look at a minimum program, which could be your single issue.
Yeah.
And let's look at the program of Extinction Rebellion. We want to focus on saving, life, right? And then let's say the transitional program would be to create these citizens' assemblies, maybe within the state, within existing states.
Yeah.
The maximum program would be to dissolve the state and to have a not just citizens' assemblies to decide matters about extinction and ecology, but citizens' assemblies that literally govern the world.
Yeah.
Have a confederation, a global confederation of confederations. And that is what people in Rojava are trying to do. And that's what that's what the communalist vision is. So again, you can have a minimum program, a transitional program, and a maximum program, where you can use the word vision, a minimum vision, a transitional vision, and a maximum vision. It becomes political when you say, my maximum vision is to have a directly democratic society that has a moral economy, again, and that is non-hierarchical, has radical inclusive humanity, and is ecological. So again, so you'd start with your, if you know where you're going and you can communicate to people within your organization, we're with you. We share right now the same minimum and transitional programs, but we're seeing this is our maximum program. And to be transparent and be educating within your movement, that would be beautiful.
Yeah, amazing. I'm going to watch this back and take some notes and try and recruit some people. So, like, bearing in mind what you've just said, do you think there's any use in people from quite different political backgrounds working together because they might have the same minimum program, for the sake of life on Earth, or but they definitely won't have the same maximum program or revolutionary program? Do we have to do that? Work with people that?
Yeah, I think it really depends on you and what you want to do. In my 20s, I did a lot of coalition work, right?
Yeah.
With people. I mean, the weirdest one that I was ever in that I love to talk about was I was in an anti-pornography group. I was a radical feminist, and I was very much the group that I was part of. We were fighting sex trafficking of women and girls, and the trafficking of women and girls used in the pornography industry. And I remember going to a meeting at someone's home, and I'm driving, and I have my mullet, and I'm like hippied out. We're all, it's the 80s, we look, crazy, yarn in our hair, the whole thing. Anyway, we're driving, and we live in like these bombed out, houses in Burlington. with roaches and drafts, and we're cold and we're dirty. We're driving, all of a sudden we're like, whoa, we're going into like suburbia. These are like, you know, middle class, nice houses. And we walk out, we knock on the door, and this woman opens the door and she's like, you know, she's horrified to see us and we're horrified to see her and her friends. It was all these Christian conservative women who were anti-pornography. And it was just a very powerful moment where we were like, oh. And we sat down, you know, on different couches, and I think they couldn't wait for us to leave. And when we left, we were like, wow, I guess you end up in bed with some really interesting people when you do kind of coalition work around a single issue. And in that case, it was not going to work. We were radical lesbian feminist separatists who were explicitly anti-state, anti-capitalist, anti-racist, et cetera. And they did not want to work with us. So, so it's like, where do you want to start? And again, I go back to the question of, I would say personally, move with the people who move you and that you're moved by, and with whom you share a set of principles. And that's, you know, that STAR is good also as a way to sort of say, I'm making this group with people, and it could be a study group that turns into a little mini organization. And you could say, do we agree that we're anti-hierarchy? Do we agree on that? Do we agree that the state is problematic and that capitalism, you know, where are these ecological problems coming from? If you can do that, you don't have to end up working with people who have such different worldview. It doesn't mean that your organization can't work in a broader coalition. You can, but you'll still be grounded and supported by people with whom you share basic principles. I think it's hard to go far with people with whom you don't share basic. That's why I've been part of the ISE for 37 years.
Wow.
There's no other group of people with whom I share a very specific set of principles that we don't have to argue about.
Okay, that's really interesting, and yeah, it totally resonates with me, and I think I'm yet to find the core group of people who I feel most comfortable with working, like, you know, some kind of affinity group or what have you. But again,
you have to start it.
Sorry?
Maybe you have to start it. You know, I'm not exaggerating. I have started in my life, I lost count, but at least 60 study groups that have some have turned into organizations and some have not, but they've all been extremely enriching and empowering and sustaining, because I'm connecting with other people. And a study group can start out as 2-3 people.
That's amazing.
ISC, we're just right now curating a set of readings that we're going to offer to people who want to start social ecology study groups. And what's crazy now is that with Zoom and the pandemic, people are starting to realize you could actually create groups of people that might not be geographically in the same place. I mean, ideally they would be, but maybe they're not.
I mean, on a grounded, close level, I think it's really important what you're saying, but also what you said about it's also okay to build broader coalitions. And just to bring back the Extinction Rebellion UK example, in the beginning, the messaging was around, this isn't about, I mean, you could say this is a dangerous game trying to do this, but broadly I supported the effort to try to appeal across the political spectrum, and it was supposed to be that, you know, the climate and ecological emergency is not a part of the sort of messaging was, it's not a political issue, it's a moral issue, which, you know, since sort of learning about social ecology, I wouldn't put it like that anymore, but I did see the kind of value in trying to reach more conservative minded people, because for a really broad movement of civil disobedience, like a really broad movement, you do need some more conservative minded people. And I think Extinction Rebellion in the UK has been successful to a point with that. So we've got ex-police officers speaking on television in support of Extinction Rebellion, and an ex-army guy doing a direct action on Remembrance Day and stuff like this, which is quite impressive. but I don't know how far that can go. And there are some, inevitably, it can sort of fracture the movement a bit as well, because you've got a lot of people on the left who don't really, on the left of the movement, who don't really approve of that. But I was even considering for my channel, deliberately contacting like ex-military and so on to interview them about the security risk of climate change, just to get people, because some people don't take things seriously unless it's like the army are involved, or but from a social ecological perspective, it just seems so far away from yeah but I guess this could be part of the minimum program, and not the but
Yeah, I mean, again, it's always about, having your issue at hand, but also, to be cheesy, to see the forest through the trees.
yeah
You have this tree and then another tree behind it, and then, oh, there's the forest I'm trying to go to.
yeah
And, I do think you will, the thing you want to avoid if you're going to take on this life is burnout. That's probably like, the greatest thing to fear. I think I've seen over the years so many of my friends and comrades get jaded and cynical and give up and get burned out. And I think what is sustaining is finding a set of people that you connect with, you have affinity for, and you share ideas. And if you keep trying too much to make connections with people who are really not interested in taking down the current order, they're not, you really don't share the same forest vision, if we use that. They don't have this, they don't see the same forest, the trees that you see. I feel like that is often a recipe for burnout, because it's just discouraging. And when you can meet with people who are buoyed up by the same ideas that you are, it's energizing, instead of being in an organization where you have to try to convince people.
yeah
And I mean, during the 90s and the 80s, I felt like in the feminist movement, I found myself in that situation a lot, where we all shared, it's weird to call it a minimum program, but we shared the minimum program of toppling patriarchy, right? And dealing with all these horrifying things that feminism needs to address. We were doing rape crisis centers and battered women shelters, and but there was no broader reconstructive vision that we shared at all. And so I was the one in every organization that I was in, and every movement that I was in, I was like the person who'd say, "But we have to really talk about the state and what's beyond." So I was, because I was at part of the ISC, I had these two, I'm in the feminist movement and I'm in the social ecology scene, and I kept trying to get people in the feminist world to come over to the social ecology scene. And what's weird is the feminist scene kind of burned out a lot. Almost everybody I know from that time is no longer doing this stuff anymore. And the social ecology folks are still going. And I think it does have something to do with having, again, a broader, longer reconstructive vision that is literally inspiring and literally engaging, and it keeps people together.
yeah okay, no, that sounds fantastic. So can we focus down a bit more on the subject of illustrative opposition? I wonder if you could explain what you wrote in the chapter about how illustrative opposition brings together the necessary and the sufficient in a single moment or a single process, and explain to myself and the viewers, if you could take us through the critical moment, the reconstructive moment, and the illustrative moment. I don't know if you want to give an example, or yeah.
Sure. I mean, there's so many. I think because I used the Burlington waterfront, I'll go back to that really old one.
That'd be great.
I think that, the critical moment, and I think it's important to name these, because I think there are things that people often forget to do. the critical moment is really saying, okay, how did this problem come to be? You know, the waterfront, how did the waterfront, how do we get to a situation where the mayor is trying to sell this land to private luxury condo owners and hotels and eke out the common people, this common area? How is this going to be privatized? How do we come here? So we look critically at the history of land use, the privatization of land, how land becomes to be owned by the city and it can be sold to private investors. That brings us into looking critically at capitalism and commodification. And so now we look at the history of land use and how did people become disenfranchised from land? And we look critically at we looked at farmers being thrown off lands all over the world. We looked at, you know, general questions of enclosures, all the kinds of enclosures, the history of enclosures that have pushed people off land and put land in the hands of the state, essentially, to be owned by capital. And so that we looked very critically at that. And then we thought, okay, now look critically again. What are the forces at play that keep us from making this land be public, from allowing citizens to make decisions about how we use land in our city? You know, what are those forces? So now we're thinking critically again. We come back to this, it's the state and it's capitalism. And it's also systems of patriarchy that keep women really out of public discussions about land use, and keep women out of the political realm at all. So in the critical moment, we're kind of doing our homework. We're educating ourselves, we're educating our communities. We call them civic forums. We would do talks in this at our public libraries on Thursday nights, if you would come, about land enclosure, about land ownership, about city management of land, about, you know, we'd go deep history, more short history, and then we would look at what could this be? What ought this movement to take over the waterfront or you know, reclaim it? Well, what ought that to become? And that brings you to the reconstructive moment. You've done your homework, and you know you've done a critical history account of the problem, and now becomes the reconstruction. And I would say, I don't write that in that chapter, but I would say, think about your minimum program, your transitional program, and your maximum program. And so in that case, for the waterfront, our minimum program was, we want the populace, the citizens, to have say over what happens at the Burlington waterfront. We want people in the town to say, we'd like a boathouse, we would like a beach to swim at, we would like grounds for picnicking and a park for kids to play in that's public. So your reconstructive vision, so our minimum program was, we want an accessible Burlington waterfront. That was our minimum program. Our transitional program was, we want to create a citizen council to do interviewing of people all over the community to see what people want. But we're going to tell everybody that our maximum vision is to create a directly democratic society with a moral economy where citizens have control, not just of waterfronts, but of everything. Where citizens will have control over every aspect of their everyday lives, over their, where do they live? Where do they work? How do they work? What are the ecological values that informed how we live and we work and we worship and we create and we have fun? So you have your reconstructive vision in those three moments of minimum, transitional, maximum, and then you come to the illustrative moment. How do you teach that? How do you convey that to people? Because you're not just educating yourselves and your organization. If you're doing, your job as activists and as revolutionaries, you're inspiring and educating people who see you. And when I wrote this book 22 years ago, there was no internet like there is today. I mean, I had email and there was like a very limited web, but You know, what's funny in rereading that chapter is I'm talking about zines, and I'm talking about newsletters, and I'm talking, you know, snail mail media. But now the kind of media open to people to do illustrative opposition is kind of like, it's more affordable and it's faster. So what would it look like to create a little video that literally illustrates? We would do street theater and we'd videotape it, but 4 people would see it on a local cable TV station. I mentioned that, like there's no local cable TV anymore. But that you could literally create a street theater action that illustrates your minimum, transitional, and maximum program, and you can videotape it and then put it on social media and blast it everywhere. You can do interviews like you're doing right now and blast that also. You can do a direct action, plan a direct action that is colorful and inspiring. Film that, video that, and blast that everywhere. The kind of scope and the scale and the affordability of being able to convey and teach has really just, 20 whatever years ago, there's no way I could even have imagined that I'd be sitting here talking to somebody in the UK about these ideas. It's like it was not even, so, but the most important part of the illustrative opposition is that I really feel like one thing that the new social movements in the US really got right, or May 68, or the civil rights movement got right, was that we're not just informing people, we're inspiring people, we're moving people. And, when I watched from my bed, I had COVID for 3 months last spring. So when I watched from my COVID sickbed, the BLM movements, in New York City, and then they were in DC, and then they were in every city in the country, and then they were around the world, I was so moved by, the socioerotic element that people were singing. People were doing the chants, because you have to do the chants, because, you're going to get your soundbite on TV, and you have to have the, people were chanting, but, in so many actions, people were performing for each other. They were dancing. People were doing all kinds of amazing dance performances. They were playing musical instruments. They were playing drums. They were creating, festivals of liberation while they were in a pandemic, while they were facing, in the United States, disgusting racist police brutality and contesting that. People were not just giving information to people. What got people onto the streets during a pandemic was people were literally emotionally moved, and they were morally moved. They were outraged by the death of George Floyd, the torture and the murder of George Floyd that they saw with their own eyes. And then they were moved to see people on the street, and they went out and they got out there too. And to me, that was, such an amazing example of illustrative opposition. People were saying, whose streets are streets? We are illustrating what it looks like to have Black and brown people on the street with dignity, feeling safe in numbers, with white allies, of allies who are there as witnesses and as, to make things safer for Black. It would not have been safe for Black and brown people to go out and be protesting in Trump's America last summer. It could have been a bloodbath. Because there were all these white allies, it made something possible. It made a kind of safety for there to be this beautiful and passionate and inspiring movement that nobody could deny. And I'm not saying that the BLM protests were, they were not promoting a revolutionary outlook. It really was, obviously it was a reform kind of movement. We want to end police. We want, defund the police. But if you could think about that as an example of people illustrating with so many media, their desire for freedom and how inspiration and moving people is as important as it is in informing people of the facts of the problems.
That's really
Because
interesting.
Americans already knew the facts. Americans know that 1 out of 4 Black and brown men are in prison. They had the information.
Yeah.
And they even knew that unarmed Black and brown people are being shot unarmed in the US. It wasn't the information, it was seeing people alive and taking their power that moved them to join them on the street.
That's really interesting because you're using illustrative opposition there in a slightly different way as a kind of not an attitude, but yeah, it's interesting how you've used it in a more in a different way because it's not, as you say, the Black Lives Matter movement hasn't been sort of a revolutionary project in the way that we've been talking about, broadly speaking, but yeah, so that seems like a nice, a good, a rich kind of added layer of meaning or to what you could mean by illustrative opposition.
There are revolutionaries that were part of the BLM
Oh,
uprisings.
yeah,
There were
yeah,
a lot of revolutionaries in that, woven in.
sure,
Um,
sure.
but
Yeah,
yeah, but overall it was, what I'm saying with, that would not be an example to me of illustrative opposition because there was no maximum vision.
yeah,
I think there were people there who did have a maximum. I know there were people who had a maximum vision. But what I was trying to really say is that what's so important in the illustrative moment is to inspire and move people.
okay, yeah. That's what I was trying to say, that there's the spirit of yeah, the illustrative nature of it. And I really love the word socio-erotic and the idea of bringing in the sensual into a political space. And you mentioned in your chapter a group that uses all these amazing different puppets, like massive puppets. But then I got to thinking about Extinction Rebellion again, and how there has been a lot of theatre as part of the street blockades and things in the UK. And personally, I might really love a lot of it, which I do. I think it's amazing, it's beautiful. But at the same time, I understand why I see these criticisms from certain quarters saying, "Oh, it's a bunch of hippies
Yeah.
blocking the road on I can't get to work." Um, and but I guess if you've got this whole revolutionary process of the example you gave of the Burlington waterfront, you've got the critical phase, the reconstructive phase, and I guess if you're involving as many people as you can in all of that, then when it comes to the illustrative phase, I guess naturally you're going to have more people involved and feeling included, and more people involved in the artistic side and everything. So I guess that's the key, is including people right from the beginning, isn't it? Because if you just,
It is.
yeah,
It's making people feel like their voice matters and they count. And in terms of the Burlington waterfront, I remember at one point saying, why don't we have kind of liberation picnics and invite people to come to the waterfront with their picnic blanket, and we'll have a teach-in at the waterfront and enjoy a beautiful day. And that could be a moment of illustrative opposition.
yeah,
If you're talking about the revolution on a picnic blanket, with your cooler and people drinking some beer. I want to say something about the puppets. It's really funny because, this whole, the kind of critique of hippie culture that was started, it's really funny, in Vermont in the 60s. It was actually a German group called Bread and Puppet, started a residency in Vermont at the same school where the ISC emerged, Goddard College.
oh, okay.
And that aesthetic became kind of like, it moved into the women's movement, it moved into ecofeminist movement, it moved into the ecology movement. That aesthetic moved into the anti-globalization movement, and then into Occupy. And then really in the 90s, 2000s, the the cops knew how effective this was, and they would just raid our conversion centers where we were making these puppets and destroy them. They'd either confiscate them or they would just destroy them. And this kept happening over and over to the point where people are not doing that so much anymore. So it looks hippie, and that's annoying to a lot of people. A lot of BIPOC people are like, okay, enough with the puppets. and so it doesn't matter what it is. Every sort of movement is going to have its own style. If it's people, enjoying music, dancing and singing and rapping to music, doing hip hop, that's cool. Doesn't matter what the medium is. It matters what the message is and how it moves people.
Yeah.
But I think about that, and it's, I remember the first time they started, they realized they got rid of the puppets because they made great photographs and videos, and they were really exciting and they drew people into the street. They were very, very effective, and that is why they made it almost impossible to do the puppet.
Yeah. So maybe I didn't realize what the time. I've just sort of realized what the time is. Maybe we could finish with a potential critique of illustrative opposition, or not even a critique, but maybe a qualification. Is it something that's only appropriate to kind of liberal democracies, or is it something that's appropriate to do under conditions of a military dictatorship, for instance, or in a sort of revolutionary moment, or is it a kind of pre-revolutionary practice, and not for a moment of mass upheaval, I guess, isn't it? It's for to do in more. Would you say?
You have to choose your moment. I mean, my thoughts go immediately to Rojava, where people are literally studying in, Rojava University, are studying about how to create a free society while they're fighting ISIS, and they're fighting the Turkish government. They're fighting for their lives.
Yeah.
So is there a lot of joy and demonstration? No. That's not where they're at. Is they're not trying to inspire and bring in people and educate people to their movement. They have their critical mass of Kurdish people trying to fight to create a direct democracy. They're calling it democratic confederalism. It's based on feminism, ecology, and direct democracy. But I would say that what's amazing is there is imagery that's very evocative and very inspiring that comes out of Rojava. And it's weird, a lot of people love seeing women, who are taking intense leadership roles in these organizations, in the armies. And I don't want to romanticize, war, or I don't want to romanticize any part of that. They're defending themselves. And but I do think that the world is getting snapshots that are very evocative and are very moving of people's bravery, and particularly women's bravery. People, we don't see this a lot, of women literally, risking their lives physically to create a new society. Women have always done it, but they're always in the background. Women have always been victims of war and have died in war and suffered and sacrificed in war. But in Rojava, you see it. And women are valued and respected and are seen as, exemplary. And that's really, if that's not illustrative opposition, the women of Rojava, I don't know what is. I mean, so many people are coming to social ecology and coming to these ideas because they are so moved by seeing people who are, they're scholarly, they're intellectual, and they're taking literal action to create the society they want to live in. It's really, again, I don't want to romanticize, because there's a lot of, they're literally in a war, and there's nothing romantic about that. But it's extremely inspiring and challenges a lot of people's, ideas about what's possible.
Yeah.
People say, we don't have time to study, we have to fight the revolution. Well, they're doing both. The Spanish anarchists, during the Spanish Civil War, they had storefront schools while they were, fighting, for their lives. They're also studying and learning. So we don't have to choose between studying and action. We don't have to choose between social movements and political movements. We don't have to choose between single issues and the revolution. We can have all of it. And in fact, unless we have all of it, we're not going to create the good society. We have to do all of it.
Okay. Chaia Heller, thank you so much